Between 1854 and 1929, 250,000 children disappeared from American cities. Not kidnapped, not lost, systematically relocated on trains heading west, most never seeing their families again. The official story calls it charity, a rescue mission to save street children from urban poverty. But when you examine what actually happened, when you look at who these children were and where they really came from, the narrative starts to fracture in disturbing ways. I started investigating this because of a single photograph. A group of children standing on a train platform, dressed identically in new clothes, faces blank with confusion. The caption read, "Orphan Train, 1890s." But the more I researched, the more questions emerged. Why were so many of these children not actually orphans? Why did parents with living children watch them loaded onto trains? Why did the program operate for 75 years with almost no oversight? And why, when you map the timeline of the orphan train movement against other historical events of the same period, does everything align with the exact decades when something else was being systematically erased from history? Let me be clear about what we know happened. Starting in September 1854, organizations in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago began gathering children from city streets and institutions. These children were dressed in new clothing, given Bibles, and loaded onto trains heading west. They traveled in groups of 10 to 40, chaperoned by a single adult. When the trains stopped in small Midwestern towns, the children were lined up. Families inspected them, checked their teeth, felt their muscles, selected the ones they wanted. Any child not chosen got back on the train and continued to the next stop. This wasn't a secret operation. Newspapers advertised the train's arrivals. Town leaders organized the selection events. It was presented as civic charity, as Christian duty, as a solution to the problem of homeless children flooding eastern cities. Charles Loring Brace, who founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853, sold it as salvation for children who would otherwise die on the streets. He wrote that Western communities had many spare places at the table of life, and these children simply needed transportation to reach them. But here's what the official narrative glosses over. Less than half of these children were actually orphans. Records show that as many as 25% had two living parents. Many families were told their children would receive education and return. Others were told placement was temporary until the family's financial situation improved. Some parents were simply not given a choice. Hazel Latimer, sent on a train as a child, later recalled the moment a matron tapped children on the head saying, "You're going to Texas." When Hazel protested that her mother was alive and in a New York hospital, the matron repeated, "You're going to Texas." No use arguing. Think about that for a moment. Children with living parents, children who knew where their mothers and fathers were, forcibly relocated hundreds of miles away with no mechanism for reunification. The program didn't require parental consent. It didn't maintain registries to track where children ended up. Siblings were routinely separated because families only wanted one child. Brothers and sisters lost each other permanently because record keeping was considered unnecessary. The scale is staggering. Over 75 years, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children were relocated this way. The discrepancy in numbers exists because organizations didn't coordinate their record keeping. Each charity maintained separate logs. Most didn't communicate statistics to each other. And in the 90 years since the last train ran, many of those records have been lost or destroyed. The estimate of 250,000 comes from surviving annual reports and newspaper accounts, but the real number could be higher. New York City alone had an estimated 30,000 to 34,000 homeless children by 1854. The influx of immigrants in the 1830s and 1840s had created massive urban poverty. Children sold matches, rags, and newspapers to survive. They formed gangs for protection. Disease epidemics, typhoid, yellow fever, influenza, killed parents and left children stranded. Areas like Misery Row around 10th Avenue became breeding grounds for crime and sickness. Police called these children street Arabs or street rats, language that made them seem less than human, easier to relocate without question. Brace positioned his program as the humane alternative: remove children from this environment, place them with morally upright farm families, give them fresh air, hard work, Christian values. The narrative was appealing, especially to Protestant reformers who saw Catholic immigrant families as morally deficient. And that's where the program's other purpose becomes visible. Catholic groups accused the Children's Aid Society, a Protestant organization, of using child placement as a conversion tool, taking children from Catholic immigrant families and placing them with Protestant farmers wasn't just charity, it was cultural erasure. The children selected for trains followed a clear pattern. They were mostly white, mostly Western European in background, chosen because they would be easiest to place with Midwestern farm families of similar ethnicity. Organizations tried to match native languages when possible. Non-white children, disabled children, older children were generally excluded. The program wasn't saving all homeless children. It was selecting specific children deemed valuable enough to relocate. What happened when these trains arrived reveals the true nature of the system. Children disembarked at predetermined stops. Town residents gathered. The selection process was public, transactional, disturbing. Adults examined children like livestock at auction. Teeth were checked for health. Arms were felt for strength. Older boys were evaluated for farm labor capacity. Younger girls were assessed for domestic work potential. The language used in historical accounts is clear. This was inspection. This was selection. This was children treated as commodities. Many children found loving homes. Some went on to prominent lives. 2 became governors, and an estimated 2 million Americans today descend from orphan train riders. But many others experienced exploitation that resembled slavery. They were used as unpaid farm labor. They were beaten, neglected, or simply worked until they ran away. An 1883 investigation found that screening of foster families was ineffective, supervision was lax, and many older boys had fled their placements. Yet the program's overall conclusion was positive because most children under 14 were leading satisfactory lives. Satisfactory by whose measure? What's remarkable is how little oversight existed throughout the program's 75-year operation. Applicants for children were supposedly screened by local committees of businessmen, ministers, or physicians, but screening was rarely thorough. Small town leaders were reluctant to reject potential foster parents who were also friends or customers. Economic and social relationships in rural communities took precedence over child welfare. Follow-up visits were inconsistent or non-existent. Children placed in abusive situations had no mechanism to report problems or request removal. And here's what makes this entire system even more troubling. The timing: the orphan trains operated from 1854 to 1929. Those dates matter because something else was happening during that exact same period, something that's been systematically written out of history books despite appearing on maps, in encyclopedias, and in official records throughout the 1700s and early 1800s. Tartaria. The name appears across maps from the 1700s and early 1800s, not hidden in footnotes, not whispered in conspiracy circles. Right there on official cartographic records, encyclopedias, geographical surveys. A vast territory spanning northern Asia, labeled with the same certainty as France or England. Then sometime in the mid-1800s, just as the orphan trains began rolling west, Tartaria disappeared from official documentation. Maps were redrawn. Encyclopedia entries were deleted. Historical records were revised to omit any reference to this massive region that had been acknowledged for over a century. The timing isn't coincidental. Between 1854 and 1929, while 250,000 children were being relocated across America under a system with minimal oversight and suspicious selectivity, an entire civilization was being systematically erased from historical record. What's disturbing isn't that these two events happened simultaneously. It's that they might have been connected in ways we're only beginning to understand. Look at what was happening in America during this exact period. Massive infrastructure projects, railroad expansion on a scale that shouldn't have been possible with the technology supposedly available. Government buildings with architectural proportions that don't make sense for human use. Structures featuring doorways 12 to 15 feet high, not at ceremonial entrances, but in working corridors. Staircases with risers so tall a normal person must stretch uncomfortably to climb them. All of this construction occurring precisely when Tartaria vanishes from maps and the orphan trains begin moving children westward in unprecedented numbers. The children transporting west served a specific function. Farm labor, yes. Domestic work, certainly. But there's another pattern in the historical record that's harder to explain. Many of these children, particularly boys of certain ages, were placed not with farming families, but near construction sites, railroad projects, mining operations. Places where large-scale infrastructure work was underway. Places that needed workers for projects whose scope seemed impossible given the era's limitations. Here's what the official narrative asks you to believe. America, barely industrialized, with limited machinery and supposedly primitive construction methods, built thousands of miles of railroad through impossible terrain, erected massive stone government buildings in towns that barely existed, and created infrastructure that still stands today despite our inability to replicate it with modern technology. And they did all of this while simultaneously relocating 250,000 children across the country for purely humanitarian reasons. Does that timeline make sense? Or does something else explain both the architectural mystery and the child relocation program? What if the buildings weren't being constructed? What if they were being repurposed? What if a previous civilization, one that employed individuals of different physical proportions, had already built these structures? And what if the Orphan Train program wasn't just about removing children from cities, but about populating newly emptied territories with a generation that had no memory of what came before? Children make perfect colonizers. They adapt, they forget, they accept whatever reality you present as normal. Take a child from New York at age 6, place them on an Iowa farm, and by age 12, they'll have no clear memory of anything different. Their children will know nothing except the story they're told. Within 2 generations, you've completely rewritten history. The children transporting west had something else in common. Most were between 4 and 14 years old, young enough to forget their origins, old enough to work, and crucially, young enough that their memories of eastern cities, of what they might have seen or heard about the world before, would fade or seem like childhood dreams. Hazel Latimer's account is revealing. She insisted her mother was alive, hospitalized in New York. The matron's response wasn't bureaucratic. It was absolute. You're going to Texas. No discussion, no verification, no consideration of family bonds. Why the urgency? Why the force? If this was truly humanitarian work, why treat a child's plea to stay near her living mother with such dismissive finality? Unless keeping families intact wasn't the goal. Unless the point was separation, relocation, the creation of a generation disconnected from their past. Now consider the architectural evidence alongside this. The same Midwest receiving trainloads of children-featured buildings that predated American settlement. Courthouses with impossible proportions. Administrative centers with engineering that doesn't match the technology supposedly available to frontier builders. Town halls in settlements barely a decade old featuring stonework and architectural sophistication that should have taken generations to develop. Local histories claim these buildings were constructed by the new settlers, but the construction dates don't align with settlement timelines. Towns founded in 1850 featuring stone buildings supposedly completed by 1852, despite lacking quarries, skilled stonemasons, or the economic base to fund such projects. The children arriving in these towns would have seen these buildings simply as what existed. They wouldn't question the proportions. they wouldn't wonder about construction methods. They'd grow up accepting massive doorways and oversized staircases as normal civic architecture, never asking who they were originally built for. This is how you erase history, not by destroying evidence, but by introducing a population with no context to question it. Let them inherit structures they didn't build. Let them adapt those structures to their use. Within a generation, the original purpose becomes forgotten. The original builders become unthinkable. The Midwest wasn't empty when settlers arrived. Native American tribes occupied the territory. But there's a gap in the archaeological record that conventional history doesn't address. Between the Native American cultures we recognize and the European settlers we document, there's architectural evidence of something else. Burial mounds containing remains of unusual size. Stone structures using construction techniques that match neither Native American nor European methods. Artifacts suggesting metallurgical knowledge that doesn't fit the accepted timeline. And these discoveries cluster in exactly the regions where orphan trains delivered the most children. Wisconsin, Ohio, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska. The same states receiving thousands of relocated children were the same states where newspapers regularly reported finding giant skeletons in ancient mounds, until those reports suddenly stopped. Michigan passed the first law prohibiting out-of-state child placement in 1887. Other states followed. By the early 1900s, the legal framework that allowed the orphan trains was collapsing, but not because of child welfare concerns. States were rejecting the children themselves, viewing them as potentially criminal, as burdens rather than assets. What changed? Why did states that initially welcomed these children begin passing laws to keep them out? Perhaps because by the 1890s, the repopulation was complete. The generation that remembered anything different was dying. The children transporting west were now adults raising their own children in the reality that had been constructed for them. The architectural mysteries were normalized. The oversized proportions were simply how buildings looked. And Tartaria was completely erased, existing only in pre-1850 maps that fewer people consulted as newer maps replaced them. The Orphan Train program officially ended in 1929. The last trainload of children arrived in Sulphur Springs, Texas, in May of that year. 75 years of systematic child relocation. 250,000 lives redirected. 2 million descendants alive today with family histories that begin, mysteriously, with a train ride west and no clear record of what came before. But here's what nobody talks about. The children themselves had no memory to lose. They were blank slates in the most literal sense. When you're 7 years old, pulled from the streets of New York, shipped west on a train you don't understand, your past becomes whatever they tell you it is. Your history begins the moment they hand you that new outfit and Bible at Grand Central Station. Everything before, gone. Charles Loring Brace understood this perfectly. His writings make it clear. He wasn't just relocating homeless children, he was reshaping them. In his own words, these street children needed to be removed from their corrupting environment and placed into morally upright settings where they could be molded into productive citizens. Translation: erase what they were, replace it with what we need them to be. The Children's Aid Society kept records, but here's the disturbing part. Those records were never comprehensive. Multiple organizations ran orphan trains. Each kept their own documentation. Most never communicated with each other. And over the decades since the last train ran, significant portions of those records vanished, lost during routine transfers, destroyed in fires, misplaced during organizational changes. The same pattern we see with the giant skeletons. The same pattern we see with Tartarian documentation. Evidence doesn't disappear by accident when it disappears this consistently. Consider what happened at the train stops themselves. Children lined up on platforms, families inspecting them like livestock, checking their teeth, their muscle development, their general health. This wasn't adoption, this was selection, and the criteria wasn't just about finding good homes. It was about finding children who would fit, who would adapt, who would forget. Older children were harder to place. They remembered too much. They questioned, they resisted, so the system favored younger children, malleable minds, blank enough to overwrite, and those who weren't selected, back on the train, another town, another platform, another inspection. Until they either found placement or aged out of the system entirely. Some children rode multiple routes, rejected repeatedly, their trauma compounding with each failed selection. The psychological damage was immense, but it served a purpose. Traumatized children don't question their new reality. They accept it. They adapt to survive. They become whatever their new environment demands. Now overlay this with the architectural timeline, the buildings that make no sense. The oversized proportions in towns barely a decade old. Children arriving in these spaces with no context to question them. Growing up in structures clearly built for different occupants. Accepting 12-foot doorways in working corridors as normal. Climbing staircases designed for longer strides without asking why. Within a single generation, the architectural evidence becomes invisible. It's just how buildings look. It's just how things are. The burial mounds present another problem. Throughout the 1800s, newspapers across the Midwest reported their excavation. Giant skeletons, sophisticated artifacts, evidence of a culture that predated accepted history. Then children arrive. Towns grow around these discoveries, and within decades, the reports stop. The mounds are plowed under for farmland. The skeletons disappear into private collections or Smithsonian storage. The physical evidence erases itself through simple agricultural expansion and institutional neglect. But something else happened that's rarely discussed. The children who rode the trains often lost their names, not officially. But practically, Hazel Latimer, one of the few orphan train riders who later shared her story publicly, described being told she was going to Texas despite having a living mother in New York. She protested. They didn't care. Her identity, her family connection, her past, none of it mattered. She was going to Texas. End of discussion. How many others experienced the same erasure? How many lost not just their location but their lineage, their family names, their cultural identity? The demographics of who rode the trains reveal another layer. Most were white children of Western European background. They were selected specifically because they would blend into Midwestern communities. Children of color, disabled children, older children, they were largely excluded. Not because they didn't need homes, because they wouldn't fit the repopulation agenda. This wasn't random charity. This was demographic engineering, and it worked. 2 million descendants alive today trace their family history back to an orphan train. 2 million people whose family trees begin with a mysterious train ride west and no clear documentation of what came before. 2 million bloodlines deliberately disconnected from their origins. By 1883, criticism of the program had grown loud enough that Brace agreed to an independent investigation. The findings were damning. Local committees weren't screening foster parents effectively. Supervision was practically non-existent. Many older boys had run away, but the overall conclusion, positive. Because the majority of children under 14 were leading satisfactory lives, satisfactory by whose standard? Children who have been traumatized, relocated, and stripped of their past don't have high expectations. Satisfactory meant alive, fed, working, not dead in a New York gutter. The bar was underground, and the screening failures weren't accidents. Small-town ministers, judges, and businessmen were supposed to vet potential foster parents. But they were reluctant to reject someone who was also a friend, a customer, a fellow church member. Social relationships in tight communities took precedence over child welfare. Everyone knew everyone. Rejecting a neighbor's application meant social consequences, so they approved placements that shouldn't have been approved. Some children were placed into homes that loved them. Andrew Burke became governor of North Dakota. John Brady became governor of Alaska. These success stories get repeated in every historical account of the orphan trains, but they're outliers presented as norms. For every child who thrived, how many were used as farm labor? How many were abused? How many spent their lives feeling displaced, never quite belonging, carrying trauma they couldn't articulate. The records don't tell us. Because the records were designed to showcase success, not document failure, by the early 1900s, states began rejecting the trains entirely. Michigan passed the first law prohibiting out-of-state child placement in 1887. Others followed, but the reasoning wasn't child protection. States viewed the children themselves as problems, potential criminals, burdens. The same children who'd been welcomed decades earlier were now unwanted. What shifted? The repopulation phase was complete. The Midwest was settled. The buildings were occupied. The architectural mysteries were normalized. The generation that might have remembered anything different was dying off. The program had served its purpose. In 1912, the U.S. Children's Bureau was established. Suddenly, the federal government cared about supporting families and alleviating the conditions that led to child homelessness. Suddenly, there were resources that could have prevented the need for orphan trains in the first place. Where were those resources in 1854? Where was that federal concern when 30,000 children lived on New York streets? The timing suggests the orphan trains weren't a response to a crisis. They were a solution to an entirely different problem. A problem that required massive population relocation. A problem that needed the past erased and rewritten. A problem that demanded children with no memory, no context, no ability to question what they were inheriting. The last orphan train arrived in Sulphur Springs, Texas, in May 1929. 75 years of systematic child relocation. And the moment it ended, the narrative shifted. The orphan trains became the precursor to modern foster care. That's the official story. A humanitarian experiment that evolved into today's child welfare system. But modern foster care operates within the child's home community. It involves extensive legal protections, court oversight, documented family histories. The orphan trains did the opposite. They severed connections, relocated children hundreds of miles away, and destroyed any paper trail linking them to their origins. What if that wasn't a flaw? What if that was the design? Because there's something nobody talks about when they discuss those 75 years of systematic relocation. The timing. The orphan trains began in 1854, right when massive architectural construction projects were reaching completion across the Midwest. Buildings that seemed too grand, too sophisticated, too precisely engineered for frontier settlements. Structures with doorways scaled for individuals taller than average humans. Infrastructure that suggested prior occupation by people we're told never existed. Then suddenly, a convenient solution appears. Flood those buildings with children who have no memory of what came before. Children who'll grow up assuming everything they see was always there. Children who'll never question the architecture because they were raised inside it. The Catholic Church wasn't wrong when they accused the Children's Aid Society of something darker than simple charity. They saw Protestant organizations systematically harvesting immigrant children, stripping them of their cultural and religious identities, and reprogramming them into a specific worldview. But maybe the religious conversion was just cover for something larger, memory replacement on a generational scale. Think about what those children represented. Blank slates, no family stories, no inherited knowledge, no grandparents telling them what the old world looked like. Just new clothes, a Bible, and whatever story their placement families chose to tell them about where they came from. 2 million descendants alive today. 2 million family trees that begin with a train ride and nothing before. That's not preserving history. That's manufacturing amnesia. The buildings those children inherited didn't match the construction capabilities of their supposed builders. Courthouses with 12-foot doors in working hallways. Administrative centers with staircases requiring enormous strides. Municipal structures featuring furniture at scales that made normal humans feel childlike, all dismissed as decorative excess or Victorian grandeur. But grandeur doesn't explain functionality. You don't build a desk chair 30 inches high for aesthetic purposes. You build it that way because the person using it needs those proportions. What did those orphan train children think when they first walked into those buildings? Did they notice the scale was wrong? Or were they too young, too traumatized, too focused on survival to question it? By the time they were old enough to wonder, they'd already internalized the official explanation. This is just how things are. This is how things have always been, except it wasn't. The photographic evidence from the 1800s shows individuals of exceptional height standing in front of those same buildings. Not circus performers, not medical anomalies documented in freak shows, just people, wearing formal attire, holding positions of authority, photographed in official capacities alongside individuals of normal stature. The proportions of those buildings make perfect sense when you place a 9-foot-tall human in the frame. Then the photographs stop appearing. The newspaper reports about giant skeleton discoveries cease. The encyclopedias stop mentioning Tartaria. And suddenly, there's a massive child relocation program delivering hundreds of thousands of blank slate humans to occupy all that mysterious architecture. You want to know why states suddenly rejected the orphan trains in the early 1900s, why children who'd been welcomed decades earlier were now viewed as potential criminals and burdens, because the repopulation phase was complete. The generation that might remember something different was dying off. The buildings were occupied by people who'd been raised to accept them without question. The architectural mysteries had been normalized. Mission accomplished. The U.S. Children's Bureau, established in 1912, suddenly offering resources to support families and prevent child homelessness. Where was that support in 1854 when 34,000 children lived on New York streets? The federal government had resources when it mattered for their purposes. They deployed a 75-year program to relocate 250,000 children, but they couldn't deploy resources to help struggling families stay together. The priorities reveal the intention. This wasn't about saving children from poverty. Poverty was the excuse. The real goal was populating recently constructed infrastructure with inhabitants who had no context for questioning what they were inheriting. Children who'd accept oversized architecture as normal because they'd never known anything different. Children who'd grow up, have families, and pass down a manufactured history that erased whatever came before. The orphan trains didn't create foster care. They created generational amnesia. They severed millions of people from their ancestral knowledge, their cultural memory, their ability to recognize that the world they inherited didn't match the story they were told about who built it. And we're still living in that manufactured reality, still walking through buildings designed for occupants of different proportions, still accepting official explanations that don't actually explain anything, still treating architectural anomalies as decorative choices rather than evidence of prior inhabitants. The children who rode those trains weren't saved. They were deployed to occupy, to normalize, to forget. Their descendants, 2 million strong, carry that amnesia in their bloodlines. Family histories that begin with a train ride west and nothing before. No knowledge of who their ancestors were, what they knew, what they witnessed, what they might have passed down if the connection hadn't been deliberately severed. Look at the buildings around you. Really look. Notice the scale. Notice the proportions. Notice the doorways that seem slightly too tall, the staircases that require stretching, the furniture in old government offices that feels oversized. Then ask yourself why. Why would anyone build that way unless the people using them required those dimensions? The orphan trains ended in 1929, the same year the Great Depression began, the same period when massive institutional changes reshaped American society, the same moment when the last generation with direct memory of the 1800s was disappearing. Convenient timing, almost like someone was tying up loose ends, closing chapters, ensuring certain questions would never be asked because the people who might ask them no longer existed. Those children deserved better. They deserved families, stability, safety. Some found it, many didn't. But all of them, every single one, deserved to know where they came from, deserved to carry their family stories forward, deserved to inherit knowledge instead of manufactured forgetting. Instead, they became tools in a larger agenda, an agenda that required erasing the past to control the present. And it worked, because here we are, descendants of that erasure, walking through evidence we've been trained not to see, accepting a timeline that doesn't align with the physical reality surrounding us. The orphan trains weren't humanitarian relief. They were the final phase of a historical rewrite, and the evidence isn't hidden in archives. It's standing right in front of you, waiting for someone willing to actually look. The buildings remember what we were taught to forget. The doorways still tower overhead. The staircases still demand impossible strides. The architecture still whispers of occupants we're told never existed. And somewhere in the Midwest, descendants of those 250,000 children walk past evidence daily, never questioning why the structures around them feel slightly wrong, slightly too large, slightly too grand for the people who supposedly built them. Because that's what the orphan trains accomplished. Not rescue, replacement. A generation deployed to inhabit mysteries and call them normal. The trains stopped running in 1929, but the forgetting continues. 2 million bloodlines disconnected from their origins, 2 million family trees that begin with silence, 2 million stories that start with a platform and nothing before. That wasn't charity. That was erasure perfected.